Okay. Welcome everyone to today's conversation focused on the fundamentals of water in Wyoming and what you really need to know about how we think about and act on water here. This is the first of several conversations leading up to the symposium we're hosting in Thermopolis on April 20th. And before I introduce our speaker and moderator for the conversation today, I'm going to make just a couple of announcements. And because I have these beautiful slides, I'm going to share my slides really quickly. So like I mentioned, this is launching the ramp up to a day-long conversation in Thermopolis focused on water, and we're going to be exploring this question of the potential for using collaborative approaches to solving some wicked water challenges in Wyoming and across our region. It felt really important that everyone have a baseline shared understanding about water in Wyoming. It is in some ways a little bit of a unique situation. So I'll introduce MacKinnon in just a minute. On April 14th, we're going to be having the second preparatory conversation looking at climate change and water in Wyoming in the West. Dr. Rangwala from CU Boulder is going to be joining us. He'll spend just a little bit of time talking about what we know in terms of drought and water availability and other impacts. But we want to have a conversation also about how to use climate change data and information to inform decision-making around water policy. So that should also be a really, really good conversation. I hope everyone can join us. And then, of course, the 20th is the symposium. I want to make sure to acknowledge that this is happening under the auspices of the Ruckelshaus Institute out of the Hobbs School here at the University of Wyoming. The Ruckelshaus Institute exists to advance the understanding and resolution of complex environmental and natural resource challenges and support stakeholder-driven solutions through a variety of mechanisms, including the collaboration program in natural resources. I see a lot of current participants and alumni joining us today, so you know all about the program, but just a reminder that we're in the middle of recruiting people to join the upcoming cohort, and would love to have people who are passionate about water join us for next year's cohort. So think about looking into the program, reach out if you have questions. And that is all I have to say about that. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Maddie Barber and MacKinnon. Maddie Barber is a third-year law student, 1 month out from graduating. And I think, I don't know if I can put this in the recording, Maddie, but I like to think that I have rescued her from being a litigator by introducing her to collaborative approaches to problem solving just in the nick of time. Maddie's been interning with me this winter and is going to be working with Anne to moderate today's conversation. And then MacKinnon, of course, is our guest expert today. Anne is based in Casper, author of the really wonderful, important book, Public Waters, that focuses on history and public understanding of water in Wyoming and what we can learn from it. And I'm just going to read the one sentence from your website and then hand it over. And her passion is for translating natural resource management issues for general audiences, and has just deep and extensive expertise in water and other related issues here and across the country. With that, Maddie and Anne, I'm going to turn it over to both of you. And thank you, Anne, so much. Again, I've said this before, but thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited for the conversation.
Thank you, Deb. As she mentioned, my name is Madison Barber. I am a 3L here at the University of Wyoming. I am just helping moderate today. So if you have questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat. We're going to try to keep interrupting down to a minimum. And so I will be the one who lets Anne know that either we have questions in the chat or that somebody's raising their hand, just so we don't get too far off track. Other than that, if you have any general questions or anything like that, I'm happy to answer them. But yeah, I will make sure that I have an eye on everything so that Anne can best serve everybody's questions and have a good conversation today. So with that, I will turn it over to Anne. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you guys for asking me and for those nice introductions. Deb asked me to do a sort of a Water Law 101, and so we allocated an hour and a half, which I hope it won't take. And since it'll be recorded, you guys can split and then come back to the recording at some point. And I will, pause for questions and that kind of thing. My own background, Deb asked me to give you a little. I was a young adult in Kentucky growing up by the Ohio River. I went to law school. I was very interested in coal and coal mining, which is a big issue in Kentucky. I ended up coming in the middle of law school. I took a year off to come to Wyoming, work for the Casper paper to report on coal, and ultimately I worked on oil and gas. I left for a year and finished law school and came back. I got more interested over time in water, partly because it moves and it connects people who maybe wish they didn't know each other, but also because here I was in Casper, North Platte River going through town. Wyoming and Nebraska got into a lawsuit in which they were both going to spend tens of millions of dollars. Well, to me, the North Platte River going through Casper looked like what we called Beargrass Creek near where I grew up. So what was going on? So I ended up eventually getting a chance to sit down with the state engineer, who was George Christopoulos at the time, a great guy. And he very cleverly gave me 3 or 4 calf-bound books that were the first reports by the first state engineer, Elwood Mead, to the state about Wyoming water. And so that's a great thing to do with a reporter. I went off to read this stack of books and didn't bother him again. I got really interested. Mead was quite a good writer, and I always had a penchant for history. I spent a lot of time in the files of the state engineer's office. I attended about 20 years of meetings of what's called the Board of Control, which is the state engineer and the superintendents of 4 water divisions, which are roughly equal to the 4 major river basins in the state. And I ended up being appointed to the Water Development Commission. I wanted to be able to think better about allocation of water in arid places. And so I ended up getting a PhD in natural resource economics. And then I put all the stuff I'd been thinking about into a book, so I didn't have to try to keep remembering it all the time. I know that some of you in this audience, as always, know a lot more about this than I do. So I look forward to your corrections. But I'll do my best to take us through it. I want to start with kind of an abstract question about, so, what is a Wyoming water right? It gives you a right to use water. Well, is that a private property right? The well-known and well-respected law professor at the University of Wyoming in the 70s, 80s, said, yeah, there's not that much difference from a property rights point of view between land and water. The Supreme Court said, yeah, that's a kind of interest in real property, but they also said, of course, the water belongs to the public. So what is that? And users of water pretty much think of it as their private property right, often, or because they put a lot of blood, sweat, tears, and money themselves or their grandparents into putting that water to use. So they think of it as a private property right. But as I sort of went through the history and the writing and the cases, the legal cases, it seems to me a better way to think about it is as it's a community property system where rights are distributed between the water users and the public, in this case, the public represented by the state engineer's office and the Board of Control. And I think as I described to you the history of Wyoming water, you can see that it's really those 2 groups who have shaped policy. They sometimes ask the legislature to enact statutes that embody their ideas, but it's pretty much those groups that handle it. And now lawyers, for you lawyers out there, we'll talk about a bundle of rights. If you have a property right, you have a bundle of rights. And economists talk about a number of rights also in relation to this kind of resource, flowing water or ocean fisheries or forests. They talk about it as a common pool resource, which means a resource that it's hard to keep people away from, but at the same time, people can diminish it, either using it all up or polluting it. And so the question that, so with that kind of common pool resource, how do you govern it, and how do you think about the rights? And economists say, okay, there's access, there's use, there's managing it, there's excluding other people, there's alienating it, saying, well, you know, the right to use it here, we're going to move that over here to somebody else, and particularly in the case of water, to another place. If you held all those things, you would have a private property right. But in Wyoming water, users definitely can access it and use it. The state, through its officers in the state engineer's office, can say who gets, they can exclude or let in people to use it. And they definitely can say whether or not you can move a right to someplace else. So neither of them have all the rights, and that's why I talk about it as a community system that is significant the way it's operating. One of the things, the reason I'm going to talk about the history is I think it is so much easier to remember and understand Wyoming water law if you know its history. And one of the things the history shows that I want to suggest is that it was not written on stone tablets and handed down by the prophet Elwood Mead, which some users will still pretty much act like was the case, that, you know, Wyoming water law is sacred and it's never changed. And really, it has changed quite a bit over time to deal with a changing state. So to start with Mead, he was very significant, and he wrote the original water laws that he got the legislature to adopt, as well as the constitutional language. His idea was that you had to come up with a system for allocating water that would create, that would help in a frontier state, because he came to Wyoming as it was territory, would help build a society and support the society, including long-term as it might change. So he was very interested in creating enough certainty so that people would invest in using water, individuals, and also enough flexibility so that things could change over time. So he adopted some things that had already been in kind of common usage, which include the priority system. First in time, first in right is how people talk about it. And that had been a creation adopted by people as they moved west. And of course, Wyoming was not one of the first places settled. California, particularly the mining communities, had this idea that if you got there first and put something to use, you deserved to have that and have as much as you had needed before anybody else who comes later could get some. And it was your reward for being that first person. And so that idea in the first in time, first in right is still with a priority system, so that if there's plenty of water, everybody gets the water they need, or even if there's lots of water, what they think they need. But if there's not a lot of water, then the people with a higher priority, the earlier date of their water right that they got is, or that they've inherited, that gets its full water right before people with later dates. And that goes even to the point where a stream can be dried up, which was certainly not something that the California miners were worried about. And you can see it happening in various Western states. But it's important to realize that in Wyoming's, from the 1880s and through Mead's system, that priority system is not some sort of automatic thing. The priorities get enforced if somebody with an early date right calls for it, asks for what they call regulation. So that doesn't always happen, and people, if if nobody has called for regulation, people can, on a stream, can manage the way they see fit. Sometimes that is somebody with a later date right, intimidating everybody else on the stream, so he gets his water even though he doesn't have the better right. Or sometimes it's everybody on the stream agreeing, okay, we're going to share and rotate water. But the priority system is underlaying that and can always be invoked. Another concept that Meade adopted that came from the sort of early water rights, water uses in the West and in Wyoming is the concept of abandonment, which people know as use it or lose it, which was that if you got there early and you got this nice early date right, but then you leave for a while or otherwise don't use that water, well, you shouldn't have that right anymore. And it was quite a short period, 5 years, which Meade adopted and is still the case in Wyoming. So if you don't use something for 5 years, use your water right, it could be abandoned. If you think about it, that's one example of why water is not like land and is not exactly a private property right, because you're not going to lose your house if you don't use it for 5 years. One of the most important things that Meade brought into this system was the idea of a permit, that you had to have a state recognized right. You had to, if it was after statehood, you had to file for a permit, get that permit approved by the state engineer's office. In that permit would be deadlines, when you had to start construction of the facility that was going to use water, when you had to finish construction, when you had actually put that water to use. Wyoming, as in all the Western states, most of the land, most of the water used in this state is used for agriculture, for irrigation. So it often had to do with putting water on the land. Those were deadlines that if you didn't meet them, the permit could be canceled. It was essentially sort of a contract between the user and the state. And once you said you had put it to use, then the state would come inspect and make sure that the water was the amount you were using was appropriate for your use, and that you were really using it, and when you really started, and so on. That again, they could find that abandonment had occurred also. So one of the ideas also that Meade talked about and was included in Wyoming water law through the work of the Board of Control was that use had to be appropriate, the amount of water had to be appropriate to what your use was. So the term that eventually got into the statutes at the behest of the state engineer's office was the beneficial use is the basis, the measure, and the limit of the right. So you don't get to waste water. Meade had some experience in Colorado before he came to Wyoming, and he was particularly concerned about, he'd seen irrigation companies who built facilities to bring water to land, saying that they held the right. And he felt very strongly that the person who was actually working the land with the water, the landowner, should be the holder of the right. So he was quite insistent on tying the water to the land, that it couldn't be transferred away again, that it was not like, a car or a horse and wagon. It couldn't be just moved someplace else. And that, well, there was at one point in 1904, the Wyoming Supreme Court was faced with a contract where somebody was moving a water right to a different portion of the stream on different lands. And the Supreme Court thought, well, yeah, it's kind of like a wagon. I mean, you can move it over there. And Meade was in Australia and wrote letters back saying this is an outrage. His protege, successor state engineer, was equally outraged. They did a survey of water users who all were like, no, this can't happen, because of the way that water makes people on a stream interdependent. So if you move a water right, so you're no longer irrigating these lands, you're irrigating some lands over here, water flows back, water is taken out at a certain point, neighbors with different date water rights, everybody gets affected by how the water has behaved on the land it was originally on. And changing that can affect everybody. So that kind of interdependence, which is one of the things that makes water so interesting, is was very clear to the water users in the state engineer's office. And they got the legislature in 1909 to put into statute that you cannot transfer a water right that way, overturning the Supreme Court opinion. Another feature that Meade introduced was the Board of Control, which I've mentioned. He wanted it to be a board of practical men, and they have all been men, but practical people who would know something about water, unlike sometimes the courts, who had a record of not knowing a lot about water volumes. So it's this board, the state engineer and the heads of the 4 water divisions, who adjudicate, and that's the establishment of water rights, possible changes within the water right, and elimination of rights. Meade's idea was that people who were trying to establish their water rights or claim abandonment against somebody else didn't have to have a lawyer. They would come before these guys who actually knew something about water and were on the ground, and get that settled. Their decisions, of course, can be appealed to the courts, but the initial determination would be by the board. Now, Meade, this whole idea, he had all the way through it, this idea of the significance of the state's role, the state's ownership of key rights. And so he even described in one report to state users in the late 1890s that he believed that ultimately people would see themselves and would in fact rent water rights from the state of Wyoming. Now that has never happened, but it gives you an idea of what he thought the relationship essentially was. So trying to implement this basically came up against reality, the climate, the terrain of Wyoming, how difficult it was to actually build any kind of water system, level the land, get the water actually to use, raise a crop. All of that was not really well understood in the 1890s. And also the size of the state made it really hard to supervise and enforce some of these ideas. So the among the things that happened was over time in the first several decades, those deadlines in the permits that were important to Meade's concept of a contract were extended for big projects, big federal projects. The state, then as now, was always eager for development and feeling there should be more. And in this case, it was irrigation development and farms. And so when a big federal project was proposed, they would have land allocated to the project. Think about, these are like the big irrigation projects on the Shoshone River or Midvale on the Wind River. They would have land allocated to them, and they would have an initial water right, 1899, 1906. And, but, you know, it was hard to get enough settlers to come. It was hard to build it was hard to get the water on the land soon enough to meet those deadlines. And so over time, state engineers, although they worried about it, extended those deadlines. So the 2 places I mentioned, on the Shoshone and on the Wind River, had deadlines extended for more than 100 years. It's certainly not the, I don't know, usually about 5 years or so that were in the initial permits. And the what that meant was that the amount of water being used, as more and more people came onto the project, and that early permit date was extended, that meant that that permit covered more and more water, which would affect the other people on the stream. And the state engineers, as I said, they worried about that. The concept originally came about from a Wyoming Attorney General who was dealing with a project that had lands allocated to it. And he said, you know, really, permits, they grant people an inchoate right to use water. And and it's kind of been reserved for them because the land was allocated to it. So that was brought up by the feds later, dealing with some of these big projects, and the Wyoming state engineers weighed it, and they were thinking about protecting other users on the stream, but they also were thinking about the fact that downstream states, whether it's Montana or Colorado or California, way downstream, that those downstream states were at the time in the teens and 20s developing faster than Wyoming. So they wanted to preserve those early dates as a priority hedge against the other states, because the other states all had their priority systems. So that was one pretty major change to Meade's system. And another one was that in the 1930s and since then, the Wyoming Supreme Court has pretty much, they've nearly eliminated the concept of abandonment because there have been so many restrictions put on it. It's very hard to get abandonment declared against your neighbor who you think has not been using their water for 5 years. I won't go into all those restrictions now, but it was done by the Wyoming Supreme Court, which has a very strong, I mean, the courts typically have a strong private property orientation, as the whole country does, and the distinction between land and water didn't always sort of reach them. And so they talked about abhorring a forfeiture, that, you don't want to see people forfeiting their private property. And so state engineers, of course, thought that, yeah, you ought to forfeit a water right, which is not pure private property, so that if you're not using it, somebody else can come along and you're not hogging that early priority right. They can get a later date right and maybe get water for it. Users accepted the view of the courts, partly because this was starting in the 30s, pretty tough times. Users added something to Wyoming water law where, if you had a right before 1945, well, if there was enough water in the river for you and everybody else with a 1945 right, or even for a number of people with a pre-45 right, yeah, you ought to be able to get twice the water that you normally would get under your water right. And so this is sort of, shutting the door to make sure that those of us who got here first would have the best shot at the water. Meanwhile, though, the state still retained the ability to declare an abandonment. Oh, I should mention that not only is it hard for an individual to get an abandonment, but the state engineer, who has the power to investigate and declare an abandonment without a private user calling for that investigation, has only done so once, because there was so much uproar about the state engineer going around abandoning people's water rights that they've never exercised that again. And other states, there can be sort of a rolling check to see, okay, well, it looks like we got to abandon these rights, they haven't been used. That doesn't happen in Wyoming. But the state did retain its various powers, including restrictions on transfers. But because of some major social economic change in the state, basically the energy industry and the prospects for big coal mines and big power plants in the 70s, that version of water energy nexus that you guys will hear about in April, there was more and more concern that water might need to be transferred to these water using industries. And so the Board of Control had experience over 50, 60 years moving some water to municipalities, because there had been early on a provision that municipalities, the domestic use, human drinking water and so bathing and so on, was a quote, a more preferred use than irrigation. So some water rights could be moved there. And so the Board of Control had experimented with, well, do we just move a water right wholesale? Well, no, they ended up deciding, okay, well, we got to think about how much did you divert before for this water right? When you were irrigating with it, how much water went back to the stream? What was that, what's called return flow? How much did you really consume then here? Well, that's the amount that you're going to be able to move. And that Border Control practice got into law in 1973. So you now can, it's been almost 50 years, you can move a water right in Wyoming. It's not easy, but you can. But you will still find plenty of water users who can tell you, no, water is tied to the land in Wyoming. You can't move it, even though that has been not true of the last 50 years. It was for the first 80. So people still have that in their minds. The state engineer's office also has been the shaper of the definition of beneficial use. It's not described, it's not laid out in statute what are the uses. The state engineers, it's sort of in the eye of the beholder, like the US Supreme Court said about pornography. Well, beneficial use is hopefully not pornographic, but the state engineer's office, they do have an internal list of what are recognized as beneficial uses, but that list has expanded over time. So it now includes things like water for flow through reservoirs, which tend to be mostly in places like Jackson, where people can afford to have ornamental ponds in their yards. But the office has adapted to that over time. There's also now in-stream flow has been protecting water in a stream so that there will be a flow in the stream, contrary to what the pure prior appropriation system would allow. That has become Wyoming law. Now, in that case, that was brought as a question to the state engineer and petitioned to let's create this. And the state engineer at the time said, whoa, that is a political hot potato. So he kicked it to the legislature. And after a number of iterations and a successful petition campaign by Wyoming residents, and it's not easy to get a petition through to meet requirements in Wyoming, we do have an in-stream flow law which allows protection of flows in a stream, but it has restrictions on it, which include, well, it's got to be the minimum amount necessary for fish, and we got to make sure that it wouldn't be better to build a reservoir to supply this. And it has to be owned by the state. So what happens is, and of course, this law was enacted in 1986, so the only in-stream flow rights that can be created are from 1986 onwards. So that's a junior priority in many places in the state. So where you tend to find in-stream flows that have been protected, and there are a number of them, the Game and Fish works it out and then it becomes owned by the state. They tend to be above where the major development is. So in a mountain area or the foothills, it is possible for people to give an existing water right to the state for the purpose of in-stream flow. And that has happened in one case, just in some irrigated lands, just an irrigated area just southeast of Pinedale. So there can be other in-stream flow places, but it tends to have been pretty much limited. The other arena of water law where you see how significant the state's role is, and where you also, I think, see how much Wyoming water users recognize that, and recognize that in spite of their strong feeling that this is a private property right, they know it's a shared resource, and that that may mean changes over time. So in interstate relations and relations with the federal government, particularly as water has become more scarce over time, I mean, also climate change, which we'll talk about later, but also with more users. There have been more and more interstate issues. So when I was talking about the North Platte getting me interested in water law, part of what was going on there was not only the state of Nebraska objecting to Wyoming plans to build a new reservoir sort of near Douglas, but also the federal government was quite concerned about less and less water for endangered species in the crane area in Nebraska, particularly for whooping cranes and some other endangered species there, because the Platte is a very hardworking river, and there was less and less water to create the habitat that the birds needed. And they were endangered species, and there was an Endangered Species Act starting in the 1970s. So Wyoming, the state of Wyoming, the state engineer's office, and the Water Development Office took on a major role in negotiating what would happen on the Platte. They're doing the same thing now on the Colorado, and they keep very much in touch with water users. They bring things back to them. They get input from the water users. They also help bring water users along to understand what's possible and what's likely to be negotiated. And what happened on the Platte was that ultimately, it was an elaborate sequence of how this happened, but ultimately the birds on the Platte got a 1904 water right, because that was from Pathfinder Reservoir, which is upstream of Casper. But that was something that everybody could wrap their heads around. Yeah, we understand priority rights, and the birds who have been there longer than 120 years. But you know, if they have a 1904 water right, then we can sort of fit them into our system, and we can understand that. And so people accepted that change. There are a number of other additional features in Wyoming water law that we can talk about. Cities were able, that part of this sort of change over time to deal with changes in the society. Cities and towns in Wyoming were able to get water rights for more water than they actually needed at the time, so they could plan for population growth. Groundwater, as it was developed post-World War II with the technology for drilling wells, that was brought into the same system with permits and use restrictions and monitoring. And interestingly enough, Wyoming did that way before Arizona or California thought about regulating groundwater properly, or even that there might be a connection with surface water. In the 60s, if you were going to move a point of diversion on the river or change use a different ditch, you'd been able to do that before then without talking to the Border Control. But then that became in the 60s because there was enough more use on the streams, that became something you had to go to the Border Control about. So if you think about that, the Border Control meets 4 times a year. So if you want to change where your diversion point is, your headgate on a stream, you have to go talk to this state board that meets only 4 times a year. It's not like, gee, I want to build a fence on around my house. It gives you a sense of how much water, in spite of Wyoming's politicians who in non-water circumstances are always talking about we don't believe in government and so on. It gives you a sense of how much Wyoming people over time have thought that Wyoming is so crucial that it's a very important part of government and of a role for the state. There have also been rules about what to happen if you're subdividing a ranch, that all those things we can talk about. So over time, this system has developed, and it's very different, and it can be different in different parts of the state, where if there's a lot of water or not many users or whatever, maybe nobody ever asked the state engineer's office, the water superintendent, to send somebody to regulate according to priority. Other places, things are pretty tight, and maybe they're regulating every year and cutting water use off on a priority basis, starting with the lowest priority, the most recent dates. And that can change, like on the Upper Green now, because of the Colorado River, because it's the headwaters of the Colorado River, there are lots of measuring devices and stuff going in a way that was never there before. But there is, as I hope I've been able to suggest, always room for some local agreements and not invoking the law. And you'll hear from places where that's happening in your April symposium in Lander. The Laramie River is an interesting place where that might occur, between Laramie and the Wheatland Irrigation District on the other side of the mountains. Water was scarce enough last year that there was tension between Wheatland and some of the irrigators on that section of the stream. There are water quality issues in Lander and Jackson and Sheridan, and there's room to think about how to use flowing water and water volume to help deal with pollution issues. So I think this distributed rights that I'm talking about is a way to deal with challenges ahead. And, we all talk about resilience these days. There is, the question is whether a system can adapt to shocks. And there have been shocks like the energy development in the last 50 years. Now we're dealing with climate change. Questions of how the system can adapt seem to do a pretty good job on the North Platte. We're working on it on the Colorado River. I think dealing with environmental needs and such as in-stream flow have been not very successful, and a major failure has been how this state system has dealt with the existence of two sovereign nations, the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho tribes, who have a very different concept about land and water. I'm going to talk after we take a little break for questions about both the Wind River and the Colorado River, which are current challenges and how our state system deals with those will tell us a lot about how resilient, how able to deal with challenges and learn and find new ways to maneuver, whether that strength will continue that has been seen to some extent over the whole history of Wyoming water law. So I want to pause, and if are there some questions, Maddie, that you want to bring up at this point?
We do not have any questions in the chat at this moment, so I will just open it up to the room. If you want to raise your hand, I'll go ahead and let you ask it this time, and if not, we can have Ann just keep going.
As I said, I think we're going to all wear each other out here, and there's so much material that I've been speeding pretty fast. There also, of course, will be room for questions at the end.
And please feel welcome to raise your hand or type something in the chat, either to me or the group as she goes on, and we can answer a question. Oh, it seems like Zach has a question, so we'll start with you.
Awesome. Hi, Ann. Thanks for the great wealth of history. I was curious, so you mentioned that the groundwater regulation was brought into the same system as surface water, and my knowledge of kind of groundwater regulation comes from California and the recent SGMA Act. So I was curious to understand, what does Wyoming consider the kind of the physical and chemical issues with extracting too much groundwater, or how does is it like a direct port over, like it's the exact same as the surface water? Or could you kind of go into a little bit more depth on how groundwater is regulated in Wyoming?
Yeah, and I'm not going to be very good on this because so much of the state uses surface water that I've concentrated more on that. But it's similar in the sense that you have to get a permit. You have to prove up the use and that it's beneficial use. You have to get that right adjudicated. Quantity is the issue that has been most attended to. Wyoming has long thought about quality and quantity as two different universes. But the quantity issue is a state engineer's office issue. So Wyoming created and I think it was 50s or 60s, it's not really recent, but I could be wrong about that, the ability to create what they call control areas, so that then, okay, we are worried here that groundwater might be mined to the extent that we're taking out more than it can be replenished, or that is there. Often groundwater is very slowly replenished, depends on which aquifer you're looking at. So then we have a board of that control area who's, I think they're elected and locally, and they make recommendations as to whether X or Y should happen, like new wells or what kind of controls, and then the state engineer makes a final decision. There was a big case that started, I don't know, a year or two ago, where a big new well was proposed in a control area east of Cheyenne, and the opponents to it claimed that it would have terrible effect on all of their uses, and particularly including their surface uses, and it would dewater streams, and because of the connections between water and surface, which vary in different places, but in where they were not able to present a whole lot of detailed evidence to show that was happening, and that idea was not accepted, but by the state engineer's office. I think the final decision may not have come down yet, but the people went to the legislature and got the legislature to shift the burden of proof. So in a control area, if you propose a big new well, you're going to have to show that you won't hurt anybody, have these effects that they were concerned about, versus the burden they had was they had to show it would. I'm not sure that answers all your questions, but quality tends to be thought about in a separate arena. I've put on programs where people, a superintendent said, well, I'm not going to stick around for the water quality part of this. This doesn't have anything to do with me. So anyway, there are great groundwater people in the state engineer's office, and there's a guy now working for water development and groundwater who was in the state engineer's office for groundwater. So there are lots of potential people who could ask who are much better on that than I am.
Let's go with Jeff next. I believe, Jeff, you're from the state engineer's office. So do you have question or anything to weigh in here?
Yeah, just wanted to comment that was a very good synopsis, if that's what you want to call it, for Wyoming water law from start to today. And I just wanted to say thank you for that. And I would agree with every word you said. So not that you needed me to fact check you at all, but
No, I do.
Just to maybe touch a little bit on Zach's question, surface water regulation is very easy, because a call is made and a hydrographer walks upstream of that head gates, finds your water, shuts them off. With groundwater, you have to file a claim that you're being interfered with. And as we know, you can't see what's going on down in the ground. In some instances, the older well that's there was drilled with different standards. They drilled to the top of the aquifer, and it doesn't take much to interfere with that when the next guy drills all the way to the bottom of the aquifer. So groundwater is very hard, takes much longer to show an impact, and then takes even at least that long to mediate that same impact. So groundwater is very hard to regulate and prove that interference and those things along that line. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Jeff.
Okay, and then I think we have one more from Nita.
Who's underwater?
Not always, but yes, thank you, Anne. That was outstanding, and I'm relatively new to Wyoming, and so your synopsis was pretty helpful. What I was, and maybe I missed it, is seem to be talking quite a bit on an individual level, but what happens when it's a community and water loss or the lack of availability of water has a community effect or an effect on, I know you referenced, I think it was sandhill cranes, but when it starts to impact a T&E species, who stands up for the community or for the species in securing the necessary waters?
Well, for a community, the individuals in a rural area that are not part of a town, even a town as small as Baggs or Dixon, they have their own wells, and Jeff was just talking about what happens with wells. But those communities each have water rights. It depends on when the community really was started. So actually I'm going to talk a little bit about that when I talk about the Colorado River, but there are communities that have water rights from the 1890s. Then they're, they have a water system and they have a water right that the town holds, the town, whatever kind of community it is. And this is also true sometimes of districts, rural water districts. They have a water right. And so they speak up for themselves. There has been a case actually in Baggs where when water was quite short about 10, 12 years ago, a neighboring rancher let some water that he could have used for irrigation, let it go by to help the community because he was really part of that community. I mean, he wasn't using the water, but he knew everybody there. And for species, unless you're a protected endangered species, there is no right of nature. There's no, I mean, those are among the things that people are trying to figure out is how to, as climate change happens, how to make it possible for there to be water for all the kind of riparian growth and stuff that makes Wyoming beautiful. Of course, the mountains and in fact the forests, the national forests, that's where the snowpack is, and the national forests have a right reserved to them. So they, but so there's some protection for the streams in the forest. I think I should move on to the, because I wanted to talk about both the Wind River and the Wind River Reservation and the Colorado River. And as I say, I know you guys are sitting here suffering for this long and speedy talk. But I think I should go on with that, and maybe if Nita, if I can be helpful, I can give you my my email or something like that. We can talk about that further. Would that be okay with you, Maddie?
Yep, that's great for me.
Okay. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are two sovereign nations, two tribes on the Wind River Reservation. It is a large area and it's very well endowed. Mountains, forests, rangeland, creeks and rivers, wildlife habitat, and oil and gas. It was originally the Shoshone tribe. The reservation was designated for the Shoshone tribe, and then the Arapaho, who had recently been their enemies, were moved in by the federal government in the late 1870s, I think. Originally, the Shoshone Reservation was 44 million acres, which lapped over into Idaho and Utah, and sort of acknowledged how the people lived because they followed herds through that whole territory. There were successive cuts from the 1860s on that have meant that that reservation now is 2.2 million acres, but it's still comparable to Yellowstone National Park in size. And those cuts happened as the railroad came, as European-based, European origin settlers came, and as the tribes were increasingly starving because the buffalo had been eliminated by federal policy, and they did not have the federal rations were not enough, and so they were starvation sales essentially to raise money by selling off parts of the reservation. Wyoming took a major part in those cuts in both land and water rights, starting with the first territorial cession. Why is that reservation so big? Through the 1900s and through a big water case that went on from 1997 to effectively about 1992, as far as the water rights of the reservation were concerned. And what drove that has to be called racism, and also a huge appetite for land and water. Thermopolis was one of the places that was cut out, sold out of the reservation for starvation reasons, and that's where you guys will be meeting for your symposium. Wes Martell would be one of your speakers, and he clearly knows a ton more about this than I do, and I was hoping that he might be here today so that he might correct and amplify and otherwise deal with what I'm saying in the way that Jeff just did. But Wes couldn't be here, he's a busy guy. So I'm going to do my best. The federal policy from the 19th century into the 20th started with separation. Oh, let's just keep all the settler type Americans separate from these tribes, pushing tribes west, and then setting up reservations where they were supposed to live, and then to assimilation. The Congress was very clear that they really didn't want to have separate identities of groups of people in the country. And of course, that's an issue that, people are still debating, I would say, in about many different groups. Our country has a hard time figuring out what an American is, and can we limit that to only people we like? And the idea was with assimilation, partly because it was the 19th century, but also because of racism. Well, these people should be farmers. I mean, really, there were a few people who were able to get education as doctors and so on, but pretty much these guys should be farmers. And okay, well, ready or not, after about 20 years of trying to make that happen, taking children away from their families, you've read a lot recently about children's deaths, either in schools they were sent to in completely other states, or even when they were relatively near their families, if they tried to escape, they might be shot. We want you guys to be farmers, and if you're not ready to be farmers, well, we're going to make you be farmers, because we're going to cut up those reservations into allotments with individual private property ownership for heads of families. And by the way, the stuff it doesn't need to be allotted because there are only so many people, we can sell that as surplus lands to new settlers. So Wyoming was very much in favor of this, and our lone congressperson at the time promoted it. Nonetheless, the tribes have worked on asserting their identity. There are about 12,500 people native people on the reservation right now. The Shoshones eventually sued the US in the 30s for having put the Arapaho on the reservation, and thereby, adding more people and potential conflict. The tribes created a wilderness area in the Wind River Mountains in the 30s, way before the US started talking about a Wilderness Act. In 1984, the tribes created a game code. Game had been pretty much hunted into oblivion and there was no game code. Since the game code has been established, that great wildlife habitat on 2 million or so acres is flourishing with wildlife again. And of course, now the tribes are working on reintroducing buffalo and hoping to declare them as wildlife, not buffalo ranches. As for water on the Wind River, there was considerable non-Indian development, which the state of Wyoming promoted at length, starting with a 1906 permit on the Wind River, and with the idea of bringing settlers in on a major portion of the reservation that had been sold off. It took maybe 15, 20 years before much irrigation got going. The feds finally took over part of the project to create what's now known as the Midvale Irrigation District. And there are also 2 other private districts on the river. And that the Midvale in particular is an example of where they kept the state engineers were agreed to keep extending the permit, so that 1906 permit, the use on the Midvale Reservation, Midvale District, has increased over time so that more water is being used under that 1906 permit. The tribes enacted an official water code that in 1989 that embodies their view of water, and that has a very broad view of water use, of what a beneficial use of water is. It includes spiritual and aesthetic uses, in-stream flow, which is enforced on the streams within the reservation, and they, occasionally update it when they need to. In 1977, the tribes complained about a proposal by the city of Riverton to drill a groundwater well, because the tribes believed that they owned the groundwater under what had been reservation lands. And that was because there was a 1908 US Supreme Court case, which came originally out of Montana, which said Indian tribes have water rights. The Indian tribes that have treaties with the US have water rights that are reserved to them, that go with the reservation under the treaty. And those water rights cannot be lost. They are a different kind of right, than there's no sort of abandonment. And their date goes to the date of the treaty. So that case was complained about by Wyoming's congressperson at the time, but it was recognized by the Department of Justice and the Department of Interior, and they brought 2 cases related to Wind River waters in the teens. They were district court cases. They didn't make it to the US Supreme Court. They didn't really need to. But while that was going on, the federal superintendent of the Wind River Irrigation District was holding regular meetings with tribal leaders. And when the lands had been allotted, so that would have been 1904-ish, the superintendent, this was before that 1908 case, had gotten water rights for state water rights for each allotted land and for each allotment. So in about 1912, when after this 1908 case, which is called the Winters case, named after one of the key players, in about 1912, when the superintendent was talking to the leaders of the tribes, he said, you really need to protect those state water rights, use it or lose it. So what you need to do is put that water to use. And of course, to do that, you're going to need horses and plows and so on. So what you should do to raise the money for that is to sell off some of the allotted lands. This was while the other cases were going through court that made it clear that the Winters Doctrine, the reserved rights, would apply on the Wind River Reservation, but the superintendent didn't mention that, and people did go ahead and sell off some of their allotments to try to get water to use. There was an irrigation system being built on the Wind River. It was supposed to, on the Wind River Reservation, it was supposed to be funded by water from the original land sales in 1904, excuse me, by money, not water, from the sales. And that money was never enough to really complete the system the way it was intended, in contrast to the system, the Midvale Irrigation District system, which was actually, which was completed and has been fully funded, and in fact was funded with some money that was taken from, and this was engineered by Wyoming's congressperson in about 1920, water money taken from what was called an Indian Appropriations Act to fund this water development, this U.S. Bureau of, well, it wasn't the Bureau of Reclamation, but this federal project at the time, which was intended for settlers, not for tribal members. What has happened on the Wind River over time, particularly in recent years, is that it's pretty regularly dewatered, as you might expect the priority system to allow. And the way a lake that feeds the river and the way a dam that diverts water to Midvale have been managed, there are a lot of impacts on what was a good fishery going through the Wind River, that now those fish have to deal with silt being flushed down the river from the diversion dam, and with less and less water in the river itself. In the lawsuit, in 1989, the Wyoming Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court recognized that the tribes have a right to 500,000 acre feet in the Wind River, but only a small portion of that is being used for irrigation on the river. The tribes tried in about 1990 to dedicate some of the water that they weren't using to in-stream flow to keep water going through the river, and that was not allowed by the Wyoming Supreme Court, who said, oh, well, in that case, if that's what you're trying to do, you got to follow Wyoming law on in-stream flow, which was restrictive enough, as I've said, that it would not allow an in-stream flow there in a heavily used part of the river. So that's where things have pretty much been for almost 30 years. And will it change? Managing flowing water and these fish, it's a common pool resource, and the economists who've done a lot of research on how that is managed around the world have pointed out that to really successfully manage that, you got to have joint knowledge, you got to have good communication among all the parties, and you have to have trust. And this relationship has not, over this 160 years, has not created much trust. So it's an interesting question whether anything can change. It is, of course, technically possible to come up with another arrangement, as long as, you know, without paying a whole lot of attention to what the court case said, unless somebody invokes that ruling. But you have to have agreement and trust to get that agreement. The state has looked at building an off-channel reservoir way up the Wind River. There are no big reservoirs serving the river above Riverton, and the tribes have looked at them building a reservoir, and in any case, if any reservoir is built in that upstream location, they want to control it, and that is where that is. So I will stop for a minute, and we can talk about the Colorado River. So do you see any more there, any more questions there, Maddie, that we need to answer right now?
Not at the moment. I can give people a sec, just think of questions for the Wind River and then the Wind River Indian Reservation section before we move on to the Colorado River.
And I am going to try to share my screen, and I have some great graphics, but I had trouble translating them into something that you guys could easily see. So I will start with one of them. Which is that. So this is a graphic using Bureau of Reclamation information, federal information, put together by the Los Angeles Times, which has a strong interest in letting people in California know what's going on with the Colorado River, because California depends a good deal on the Colorado River. So it pretty much shows you, you can see available water consumption, and the years down below. Lake Mead elevation, you've all, I think, seen probably the photographs of bathtub rings in Mead and Powell. And so there you see the changing Mead elevation, but the two blue blobs are pretty interesting to realize that consumption has met and surpassed demand in recent years. And as that has happened, the level of water in the reservoir, which was designed to make sure that secure water deliveries could be made to places like California, it has dropped. And so the ability to make secure deliveries has dropped also. So now I'm going to try to share something else. See if I can do this. So this is another LA Times graphic using federal figures. And I think it's important to get a sense. You see Wyoming there with about 1/3 of a million acre feet of use. Colorado uses a lot more, but man, look at Arizona and California. So that gives you a sense of where that water has been going and who's been using it, and what some of the stakes might be for various ones of the players. So let me reorganize my screen here. So basically what's happened is climate change and aridification, serious aridification, 20 years of what was originally called drought, and it's pretty clear that it's turning the Colorado River Basin into something else. Both Mead and Powell, the big reservoirs on the river, are low, and there are people that don't expect to see them refill. They might get a little higher, but not refill in their lifetimes. Now, this is where Jeff is like totally involved in this subject. So I'll try to be speedy so he can clean up whatever mess I create in trying to describe this, because it is quite complicated. One thing that is worth knowing is that in all of the West, about 80% of the water that is consumed for agriculture, and half of all the water that is used, including municipal uses, is used to grow alfalfa or grass hay, and most of that goes to beef. And in the US, our per capita beef consumption is about 4 times the average of what people elsewhere in the world consume. So there was a recent paper by international and US scientists saying, well, eating beef is draining our rivers. So that's something to think about. I know some of you are interested in regenerative agriculture, and it isn't necessarily a solution to this whole thing, but it may play a little part. In Wyoming, we are one of the headwaters of the Colorado. The Green River Basin, the Little Snake River Basin, so from Kemmerer to Rock Springs, Pinedale, Baggs, but also Cheyenne, which diverts water from the Little Snake Basin and relies on a good deal of it, diverting Colorado River water, relies on a transbasin diversion to help serve the city of Cheyenne. So here we are once again with a common pool resource, this river, and how do we govern it? And it requires common knowledge and trust. And we have a setup that was done 100 years ago, a little bit like what Meade set up. And I mean, it's not the same setup, but I mean, an old framework of rules for governing. That was what was called the Colorado River Compact, signed in 1922, which very clearly assumed that there would be a different river, maybe 17, 18 million acre feet every year. Now it's 12, 11. People think it may drop further in terms of the natural flow every year. So the whole basin is trying to find solutions. And they, in the past 20 years, as what seemed to be a drought, and drought means it would end, right? But it's not ending. Well, so over time, over these past 20 years, the states have collaborated rather than gone to court, which they have done in the past, to figure out how they could use less. There has been a lot of conservation. The city of Las Vegas and the state of Arizona have managed to reduce their entire water consumption, even though their populations have gone up. And what's going on now is working towards a short-term plan for what water can and should only, what limits on water use there should be from now through 2026. And that's where you've heard, they have to come up with plan. And it is true. The idea is that a plan needs to emerge in 6 or 8 months, compared to 10 years. Sometimes they took in between the year 2020, 2022 to come up with a plan that had triggers for who was going to take less at what point, depending on where the reservoirs, what the level of the reservoirs was. So, and that's all that people describe as particularly the lower basin states, as having been very painful cuts. Then at the same time, the states are working towards a longer term plan, which they hope would be able to stay for a while, which again would have triggers in it, probably about what cuts have to happen if what happens in terms of flows and reservoir levels. And that is supposed to go into place, be implemented in the year 2027. So and meanwhile, of course, water users are like, well, no, we want to know. Well, they're still working on it. So it's really, there isn't a lot of certainty to say what water you're going to have when. It's important to realize that there's a huge federal role here, because the federal government was invited in to build Lake Mead, Hoover Dam, which to both, this is in the 20s and early 30s, to avoid floods that the river had created in California, and to create a secure deliveries of water to Arizona and California and Nevada. And so, and to do that, to get the political backing to put that kind of investment in the river, is why the Colorado River Compact was created. The states came together with the upper basin states, of which we're one. It's Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and a little piece of New Mexico that feeds the Colorado River. We were quite concerned that, California, this 1920s, it's growing really fast. And here we are still trying to get irrigation going in Wyoming. So we want to protect some kind of right to develop in the future so that their priority on the whole river system doesn't just draw water down to California and we can't develop at all. So they came up with the idea of dividing the river at a point that's just above the Grand Canyon and agreeing that the obligation of the upper basin states would be not to allow their use of water, their consumption of water, to reduce the flows in the rivers so much that over 10 years, there would not be 750 million acre feet that had, did I say that right? I hope so. Yeah, 75, right. Sorry, 775 million over 10 years. 7.5 million a year, and then it's a 10-year average, they figured out. So that we could imagine growing into more uses, and there'd be a limit on how much water the guys downstream had to see. So, but having had that happen, and the feds building that big reservoir, they became the water masters on the river, in the term the Supreme Court used. Every user, and this is like the communities, the cities, the irrigation districts, one of the irrigation districts, the Imperial Irrigation District in California, is the biggest user of water on the entire Colorado River. They all have contracts with the Bureau of Reclamation to get water delivered because of the Bureau's management of Lake Mead. Well, that means if you've got a contract, you've been trying to rely on it, but they could cut you off, and invoking danger to the facility, total change of circumstance, and so on. And so that's the powers that the feds have in the southern half, the lower basin it's called. It's important to realize there's been a lot of press, and as a former press person, I'm sorry to say that I think it's been much overblown, the idea of, oh, there was a deadline that the states had to meet in August, and oh, another one in the end of January, and they haven't met them. Well, what's been going on is all the states trying to work towards proposals that the Bureau of Reclamation can review in terms of how to do these operations. And they have come up with proposals. Most recently, California, the 6 states, not including California, submitted a proposal to the Bureau to consider in an EIS about what they're going to do over the next few years. And the state of California submitted a different one, and the total volumes they thought had to be cut were different at the beginning, but as things got more drastic, if they did, the volumes were not so different, but the allocation of who would take the cuts was quite different. And so what's the issues that the states have to deal with in trying to come up with something, and that the Bureau has to deal with to try to figure out what would be the most workable solution that the states could support and implement, is, for one thing, the stumbling blocks in those kind of agreements are that the upper basin states do not want to have themselves bear the entire burden of climate change, which could happen to them if they had to completely to start cutting back their uses so as to make sure that the right amount of water passes down through that dividing point. They also, as part of that concern, want to see the lower basin states. There's a lot of evaporation in those big reservoirs, which are in desert country, and this Imperial Irrigation District has an open canal that runs through 80 miles of desert to get to it from the Colorado River. All that evaporation is never counted as part of the use that those states make, even though in the lower basin, even though the evaporation from our reservoirs is counted against our total use, and as a use that affects what water goes downstream. And meanwhile, California, and this is the main difference in the allocation schemes, both doesn't like the idea of counting evaporation, but particularly is citing its own priority we developed early. And oh, by the way, in the late 60s, when the Central Arizona Project pipeline was built to serve a growing Arizona, we made sure that we got it into federal law that if there was ever less water in the river than at the time we thought there would be, that we will take priority over Arizona needs. Meanwhile, there's also many tribes on the Colorado River. The Wind River tribes are not affected because that's connected with the Missouri system. And they have reserved rights under their treaties. Often they don't have real water associated with that, and they have never been part of any of these. They've never been at the table, so to say, for negotiations, including in the compact itself. So they want to get a structural role of some type. And of course, the environment was not considered in 1922, and there are a number of NGOs that want to protect a variety of values along the river. So the big snowpack we had this year is not going to have any difference after 20 years of drying soils and so on. The states are working on their projects. On their proposals, and the Bureau is reviewing them in the EIS for the next few years, and then they're just starting to figure out what the process will be for coming up for a long-term plan that would start getting into effect in 2027. I don't think there's going to be a new compact, but there could well be a new deal kind of under the umbrella of the compact. So I am really running out of time, but I will try to talk about Wyoming. Wyoming has been heavily involved in all these talks with a lot of respect from the other states, because we've had some people with longtime experience there in those conversations. One of the things that's been important to get across to the lower basin is how different it is here. We don't rely on set volumes of water. The priority system comes into play often on a number of our streams almost every year as water flows diminish during the summer. There's no authority in Wyoming law to just say, okay, well, we got to cut everybody back, unless there is a curtailment under the Colorado River Compact, which became part of state law as well as federal law. But that has to be a declaration by the upper states that they have not been able to meet that obligation to not consume so much that it doesn't deplete the required flow going down below the dividing line. And so if there were a curtailment, it would hit everybody in Wyoming, but it would mean cutting back by priority rights, and it wouldn't hit those whose rights are before 1922. Excuse me, I shouldn't say everybody in Wyoming. Everybody in the Wyoming portion of the Colorado River Basin could be affected, but people with pre-22 rights would not be. Cities and industry, you know, the history of Wyoming, they tend to be later developing, so they have later rights, so they could be more affected. Even agricultural, even the irrigators who have nice early date 1890s rights could be affected because they wouldn't get double their surplus water that they managed to get approved in 1945, because it's pretty clear that curtailment will cut back past 1945. So that's a 1945 right that they wouldn't get, which for a number of people means they couldn't raise crops. So there's lots of opportunity for deals between people in Wyoming, and that is, people are looking at that in the face of curtailment, but they're also trying to completely hold off curtailment by looking at systems for maybe paying people with some new federal money from the two bipartisan bills that got through Congress to pay people to use less. And that is going on right now. The state has received some applications for projects that will happen this summer. They're hoping to do more permanently, more infrastructure type of things that will make for more permanent conservation next year, and then probably a longer term, what's called demand management system to keep making that happen. And they're looking at things like, are we losing water in long canals that aren't lined or don't have pipe? And that's being counted as consumption. How do we measure that? There's a whole study going on about that Wyoming has funded. And then, of course, there's some Wyoming environmental impacts that need to be avoided. So it's a big ball of wax for Wyoming as they deal with the other states and think about it internally. And here I am at the end of your hour and a half. But anybody who can stand to linger for questions, you're welcome.
And if you can hang out and people want to hang out a little bit more, I'm happy to continue hosting. Hopefully Maddie can stick around too. But for those of you who have to go, thank you so much for coming. And I hope to see you on the 14th. I put a couple links in the chat box. Be sure to check those out before you disappear. And for the rest of you who are able to hang out, questions, comments, Jeff Cowley, who's here, is going to be speaking on the Colorado River issues at greater depth in Thermopolis. But Jeff, I don't know if there's anything you want to add as we wrap up that part of it.
And just a couple comments. The Colorado River is a all-encompassing thing that the state engineer's office is dealing with not very many people. Other states have quite an entourage when we show up to meetings, and we have 5 total working on every issue that you could imagine. When the reservoirs were full, no one knew their name. And I'm talking about Lakes Powell and Meade. When they're half full, people started to notice and ask questions. And now that they're a quarter full, the entire world knows about Lake Powell and Meade, and we are dealing with it every single day. I guess to add a little bit there, and I'm going to get these numbers wrong, but 40 million people, 7 states, and another country, and billions of dollars of economy, whether it's municipal, agriculture, all of the power generation. If aridification at least has taught people that water does not come from the faucet. There are many, many thousands of connections between where that snowflake falls to your faucet. And if people continue to think water comes from the faucet, then we will continue to have problems. But if we can all learn that it is a much more connected thing to, like this year, the snow that is incredible in certain places, that we're going to be telling our grandkids about this year, about how the snow came and the bump that it will make in Lake Powell, but it's not going to save the day. We need 20 of these years in a row before we make a dent in what the hole we've created over the years. Yeah, dude, I'll leave it at that. I could talk about the Colorado River for hours and hours, but nobody else wants to hear about it. So,
Here, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff. And you should all lobby your legislators for more money for the state engineer's office for Colorado River.
Yeah, Jeff, I'm curious if
we got some, but still not what we need. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just curious. So it seems like the physical reality has kind of shown that the historical agreements in place are kind of not working, right? Is there any discussions in these negotiations about how collaboration needs to be structured going forward? Or do you feel like it's going to be like, let's fix the problem now, and then we'll return to this maybe in 100 years where things have changed even more physically? Or I'm curious if that's been coming up in the negotiations.
Oh, definitely. I mean, there are lots and lots of people at the table now trying to come up with, especially the SCIS for the post-2026 operational guidelines of those 2 reservoirs. Yeah, we're working on that right now. And like Ann had mentioned, the 6 states plus 1 state letters on that. I don't know if you all know, but we were very, very close to getting 7 states to sign off on that letter, but it came down to who takes the cut. And California has its views, Arizona has its views. Neither one of them are wrong. but but it is so involved, and like I said, 40 million people relying on this river, and getting them all to stand in line and agree to one thing is a monumental task. But we are working on it every single day. I mean, you may not hear about it all, but we are reaching out. State Engineer's Office is having webinars, which is a thing we've never done before. The Colorado River Working Group, which is now going to be the Colorado River Advisory Council, is a new thing that will be starting up after April. So public outreach, if you have any questions, call us. I mean, we are here to help people understand what's going on for Wyoming and all the upper basin states and the other states, and even Mexico is involved.
And I think, Jeff, I think this is right, that Interior's process for the post, they're still working on creating the structure of the process for the post 2026, which, and they've gotten a lot of comments saying, well, X and Y needs to be involved and here's how it should go. And they're still trying to figure that out, including the tribes who want to be part of the discussion, and the NGOs, I assume, said something along those lines.
Yeah, everyone is involved. Tribes, NGOs, every state. It all encompassing.
Any other questions or comments from people who are able to stick around? Awesome. Well, Maddie, any last words from you?
No, thank you everybody so much for coming and hanging out with us. This recording will be posted on the website for the symposium as well. So once we get that up, if you want to share it with a friend, or like let somebody know about it so they can go back and watch it as well if they're coming to the symposium, that would be great. But we'll let you know where to find that once it's posted.
Anne, any closing thoughts?
Goodness, no, I'm sorry that it went on so long, but you asked for a lot.
I did. I asked for a lot. And class, thank you so much for.
Yeah. And thank you, Jeff. I'm so glad you were here and that you stuck it out, which is very nice of you.
No problem at all. Thank you.
All right. Well, hope to see everyone on April 14th, and we'll be in touch really soon. But again, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll talk soon.
Oh, and I should say I can't make it to the April meeting. I hope you guys have a great time and learn a lot.
Gonna be good. All right. Have a great afternoon and weekend.
That's all. Bye.